I have a little fact for you. It's a history fact, of course. We deal in history facts here. Prior to the Watergate hearings and the more recent January 6th hearings, the longest and most significant set of congressional hearings occurred in 1871. They were hearings over vigilante violence in the former Confederacy. The official title was Testimony Taken by the Joint Select Committee to Inquire in the Conditions of Affairs in the Late Insurrectionary States. I think that's the exact title. I'm like 95% sure that that's the exact title. So for a quick timeline, for those of you who aren't intimately familiar with mid-19th century American history, 1860 is the election of Abraham Lincoln and the secession crisis. 1861, April, South Carolina fires on Fort Sumter, beginning the Civil War. Civil War continues for 4 years. April 1865, General Lee surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. That kind of officially ends hostilities in the Civil War, although there is some sporadic fighting in the Western theater that continues through the year. In December 1865, the nation ratifies the 13th Amendment, ending chattel slavery. Lincoln is, of course, assassinated earlier in the year. Andrew Johnson is president. There is a tussle back and forth between Congress and Johnson over the nation's Reconstruction policies, which culminates in the impeachment of Andrew Johnson in 1868, although he is not removed, and the election of Ulysses S. Grant, former General-in-Chief of the Grand Army of the Republic, to the presidency. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which among other things establishes birthright citizenship, is ratified in 1868, and the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibits discrimination in voting on the basis of race, is ratified in 1870. In the former Confederate states, loyal citizens and freed people have created new state constitutions and are trying to organize new governments to pursue Reconstruction policies at the state level. Now, in the midst of all of this, former Confederates are still around. Some former Confederates have reconciled themselves to the new state of affairs and are just trying to live their lives, but others have not. And they respond to the newfound freedom of Black Americans, their enfranchisement, and their political participation with violence. This is where we get the Ku Klux Klan, or at least the first iteration of the Ku Klux Klan. It's where we get similar vigilante groups like the Knights of the White Camellia. If you want to learn more about this, Elaine Parsons' book, Ku Klux, The Birth of the Ku Klux Klan During Reconstruction, is a great resource. This vigilante violence is horrendous. Wanton killings, destruction of property, sexual assaults against men, women, and children. Terror campaigns that send entire communities into hiding. Reports of this violence makes it all the way back to Washington. This violence is reported in newspapers. It makes its way to lawmakers. And President Grant and the Republican Congress decide that they're going to do something about it. In 1870, they pass the First Enforcement Act, which is designed to protect voting in the South. At the start of 1871, they pass a Second Enforcement Act that is also designed to strengthen that First Enforcement Act. The origins of the Federal Department of Justice lie, in fact, in the efforts to protect the formerly enslaved from this vigilante violence. In 1871, Congress passed its Third Enforcement Act, called the Ku Klux Klan Act. It provided federal recourse for Americans whose civil rights were violated by state and local officers. Some of these state and local officers, of course, would have been part of these vigilante groups attacking Black Americans. And it's worth saying that this law, passed to fight the Ku Klux Klan, still matters for us today. The reason you are able to sue a local police officer or a state police officer for violation of the constitutional rights is because of this first Ku Klux Klan Act. Now, I believe that this Third Enforcement Act, this Ku Klux Klan Act, is passed in April of 1871. And Congress goes on recess for the summer shortly thereafter. But before they do, they establish a select committee to do investigation into Klan and other vigilante violence in the South. Members travel down south, and they also, when they reconvene, bring people back into Washington for testimony. This is where it gets really interesting. Over the course of 7 months, beginning in June, this committee interviews hundreds of Black Americans, people who just several years ago were enslaved, interviews them for the Congressional record to get their testimony on what has been happening to them in the South. And what we know, so much of what we know about vigilante violence in this period comes from this testimony. It comes from the words of ordinary Black people telling their representatives, telling lawmakers what is happening to them and the cost it is exerting on themselves and their communities. If you want to learn more about this, I highly recommend reading I Saw Death Coming, A History of Terror and Survival in the War Against Reconstruction by Kidada Williams. It is an excellent book and relies heavily on this testimony. This testimony spurs the federal government to take even more aggressive action against the Klan, and this newly formed Department of Justice under Attorney General Amos T. Ackerman ends up securing 3,000 indictments and about 600 convictions against Klan members and other vigilantes. It destroys the Klan. The Klan doesn't emerge until 1915, after the release of Birth of the Nation, when it comes back in a new form. One part white supremacist and nativist terror group, one part, interestingly enough, multi-level marketing scheme. And there's a whole story to tell about how the end of that Klan is very much tied up in the fact that it was a big old scam, which, you know, white supremacy, big scam, that is just the case, right? That is just what is true. White supremacy in all of its forms is a big old scam. Big old scam. But again, different discussion. That's not the topic of this particular video. Why am I talking about a bunch of hearings in 1871? Beyond the fact that it's an interesting story and one you should know. The reason I'm talking about them is because I very much think, that the elimination of immigration and customs enforcement and the reorganization of the Department of Homeland Security, meaning its essential dissolution and its functions being given to different agencies, is a real political possibility, something that is within the horizon of things that can be accomplished. I think that because of recent polling that has shown that the country has turned pretty strongly against ICE after the killing of Renee Nicole Good in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Majorities of Americans say the shooting was unjustified. Majorities of Americans say they want more restrictions on ICE agents. Majorities of Americans say that they want to reduce funding for ICE. And not quite majorities, pluralities of Americans say that they would entertain eliminating ICE altogether. Depending on the poll, it's 42%, and there's still more opposed than for. And there are some polls where it's 46%, and some are more for than opposed. But it's clear that Abolish ICE has moved well into the mainstream of American politics. And it's happened quickly. So quickly that I'm really not sure that people in professional politics have really caught up with it. Ending ICE within the realm of possibility. But not immediately, right? Republicans still control the House and the Senate, and they just voted to give tens and tens of billions of dollars to ICE, slashing health benefits, slashing food assistance to pay for more funding for ICE. The president, obviously, is still Donald Trump, and ICE is his personal secret police. He is not going to sign any bill getting rid of ICE. And besides, seeing thugs brutalize brown people is the only way Stephen Miller can shoot.
A sexual matador, right?
So our time horizon here isn't next month or 2 months from now or 3 months from now. Our time horizon here really is January 2029. That is the first point under the best case political scenario where it becomes possible to do this. And that's a world in which Democrats have the House and the Senate and the presidency. So the question for me is, how does one get from mounting public opposition to this agency to, let's say, the Renee Good No Secret Police Act of 2029, right? How does one get from point A to point B? One step, obviously, is taking what actions that can be taken. At the end of this month, there's going to be a vote over funding for the government for the next chunk of time, for the next chunk of the calendar. And that funding will include money for the Department of Homeland Security. So one short-term step is to leverage that fight, leverage the fact that Republicans need Democratic votes to get this funding through, to impose conditions on ICE, things that are in the immediate realm of political possibility that Republicans might vote for because they're so popular, things that can be accomplished, which wouldn't fix the fundamental problem, but which would make ICE a little more vulnerable. And then we have the midterm elections, and best case scenario there, right? Democrats win the House and the Senate. And then it's 2027, and there's still the Republican president, whether Trump or Vance, we'll see what happens, and a Democratic Congress. So what can that Democratic Congress do with Trump as president to prepare the ground for fundamental changes? And to be clear, this is still going to have to be argued out among Democrats, right? There are still going to be a lot of Democrats reluctant to go this far. And so part of the story here is outside political pressure, as well as what is certain to be the continuing political abuses that I hope will provide even more momentum to do something fundamental. What can be done in this 2027-2028 period? And this is where hearings come in. There's this really interesting idea from a scholar of Congress named Josh Chaffetz at Georgetown University Law School called Congressional overspeech. Congressional overspeech. The idea is that congressional oversight doesn't have to be the kind of staid, bipartisan affair that we assume it is. That congressional oversight can actually be dramatic, can be divisive, can be partisan, can be something that draws the public's attention in a big splashy way to things that are worthy of the public's attention. You can think of those 1871 hearings, which were widely publicized and very controversial, as a form of congressional overspeech. The January 6 hearings were congressional overspeech. And there's other things you can do. There's something in the Constitution called the Speech and Debate Clause, which says that members of Congress cannot be prosecuted or sued for the things they say on the House floor or the Senate floor, which allows members of Congress to say all kinds of things. And if you wanted to use your position on the floor to say some mean words about ICE, introduce some evidence and some anecdotes about ICE abuses into the record, you could do that. Anti-ICE hearings as congressional overspeech, though, is a thing that is possible. And the thing about hearings, right, is that although we have all of this social media video, we have all of these accounts of what's happening, hearings turn what can be indeterminate, what can be contested, into something like an official record, into something that is hard to contest. January 6th remains the official record. The January 6 hearings remains the official record of the insurrection. The 1871 hearings remain the official record of that Klan violence. Turning these things into official records is powerful. And it's even more powerful when you have the testimony of the people affected, of the victims, bringing people assaulted by ICE, bringing people whose families have been attacked by ICE to Congress, giving them the dignity and respect of sitting before a congressional committee and explaining what has happened to them, forcing the country to reckon with what we've done. That can be powerful. And bringing all the images, all the videos, everything we have, this testimony, into a single package to show the American public that this is what ICE and Customs and Border Protection have been doing to Americans and immigrants alike. That this is what ICE and Customs and Border Protection have been doing to Americans, whether they're immigrants or citizens, is, I think, a powerful and valuable thing to do. And in the most crass political terms, it can give momentum to efforts to do fundamental reform, make it clear to the broad public as well as their legislators that there's no choice but to do fundamental reform. And if one thing we're interested in is criminal prosecutions of the people involved in this ICE reign of terror, in this Customs and Border Protection reign of terror, then hearings zeroing in on the criminal offenses done to ordinary people is one way to build and sustain political support for that kind of accountability when it is possible. And having all of this on the official record makes it so much more difficult for people to challenge the kind of indeterminacy of video. The temptation to say, oh, well, could something else be happening? No, we have the testimony, we have the video, we have the records, and we have it from hundreds of people. The question, I think, for trying to actually eliminate this agency is how we keep its abuses at the top of the political agenda. And congressional hearings, dramatic congressional hearings, divisive congressional hearings modeled after 1871, and I think the Jan 6 hearings are one important tool in the toolbox. And if anything, the people who have been assaulted and attacked by ICE deserve to be able to say their piece, tell their stories. We owe them that much.